Welcome to Workin It Out with Dr. V. Today's guest is HR expert Salandra Fleming with co-host Norman Bailey. Got problems on the job, we're working it out.
With Dr.
Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out.
With Dr.
Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out. Dr. V.
Welcome to Workin It Out. We're your show to help you triumph over workplace stress. I'm glad to be here. I'm your host, Dr. V, or known as Dr. Vanessa Weaver, but call me Dr. V. And as you could probably tell, I'm struggling a little bit with the cold, so I might have to be relying on my co-host, the renowned Norman Bailey, to help us get through this.
Indeed.
But as our executive producer, Joe Coleman, stated, we have to persevere no matter what.
Amen.
So I'm excited to be here, and it's a blessing to continue to have our listeners join us for what we consider a really critical and important topic. How do we triumph over workplace stress? So today Norman and I are really excited to welcome you because we are adding a new addition to our show, not a new person necessarily, but a new addition to our show.
Taking it up another level.
Taking it up another level. Thank you for your creative insight, Norman.
Thank you.
And what we're doing today is we're adding this new segment called the HR, which is an HR feature, and it really focuses on what are your rights, because we think it's important as you think about triumphing, excuse my code again, over workplace stress, that you know what are your rights and privileges as an employee, as a leader, and even as an owner in an organization. And so we have a renowned HR expert with us with over 20 plus years of experience, although she doesn't look like it, right? Superstar. Her name is Salandra Fleming. And you might have heard Salandra in our first show when we featured Iyanla Van Zant, and we were talking about just what is stress and the fact that stress can kill you. And Salandra was just so awesome in that show that we've asked her to come back and do a weekly feature for us as part of our Working It Out series. So
thank you, Vanessa. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Well, and what we're going to do today, really in the next 3 HR segments, is really talk about this whole notion of bullying at the workplace. Yeah. And a lot of times we think of bullying as it impacts our children or teenagers over cyberbullying and all of that.
Right.
But what the data says, and you all know I research everything.
Oh, absolutely. Right? We got the stats.
But what the data says is that almost 8 out of 10 employees experience bullying at some point in their work life. And it has a tremendous impact, not only on the psyche of an individual, but the productivity of an organization. So Salandra is going to partner with Norman and me to talk about just what is workplace bullying. And today we're going to focus on just understanding what that is and how is that different from harassment. And then we're going to really then segue into talking about bosses that are bullies. So that's what we're going to do with today's show. And then on our next feature, we're going to talk about the way peers sabotage you in the workplace and the fact that peers can be a bully. And then we're going to wrap it up with talking about discrimination and harassment as a form of bullying in the workplace. And so we want to say again, welcome to Salandra.
Thank you.
And it was so interesting. I was talking to a friend, right, and telling them about this show that we're doing.
Okay.
And she was sharing with me the situation in her workplace where the supervisor, and he's been there like 15 years.
Okay.
And he has really annihilated the employees in an organization. He has been verbally abusive to them, has really not represented their interests very well, they've caught him in situations where he's been outright lying, if I can say that, in terms of what he reported that they did versus what they did.
This guy's a serious character.
He's a serious character. And, the organization knew about it. I mean, his behavior was not unknown to the organization. But what had happened is individuals were reporting him individually.
Okay.
And at this particular point, they got together as a collective group and went to the supervisor of that individual because they realized that they were experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was phenomenal because we think of PTSD as something that people who have been in war in the military have.
Exactly.
But what we're becoming to appreciate is that if you've been the chronic recipient of bullying or mistreatment in the workplace, you can, in fact, develop PTSD.
Oh, yeah.
And so we thought, I was thinking, and then talk with Norm. This is a critical topic for us to talk about. If we're here to help people triumph over workplace stress, then this is a topic not only that the person that's being bullied need to hear, but the bullier needs to hear that as well. So that's what we're going to talk about. So Salandra, let me ask you, and excuse me again, my listening audience, if I'm sounding a little, because my nose is really killing me.
I just might have stole Dr. B from us.
I feel like Dr. B is gone somewhere. But I'd like to ask Salandra, if you don't mind, Norman, if I can start that. Well, just to talk to us or define to us, what is bullying in the workplace?
Sure, and it is important to define, and you talked a little bit before about distinguishing that from harassment, and particularly how the law defines harassment. And there are some terms that specifically define bullying, and it's typically repetitive, enduring behavior with an intention to intimidate, to ridicule, to shame, to isolate, to sabotage, or threaten another person. And so that is typically what is defined as bullying. It's not one-off incident. It's something that's ongoing or repetitive and even escalates. A pattern, absolutely. Without that pattern, you probably won't be able to call it bullying or establish any kind of rights or recourse in the workplace. If it's a one or two off, you want to just address that as an isolated incident.
Well, I'm curious when you talk about that, because I mean, for different folks, pattern may mean different things. So, if it's 2 or 3 times over a course of a year, I mean, does it have to be close in proximity? I mean, is there any parameters on that?
It's going to depend on the severity of the behavior and the timeline. So there will be multiple factors that will contribute to, a diagnosis or calling it that, and also to what is the result of that behavior, how it's handled with the workplace. And Vanessa, I'm shaking my head as you're describing this situation at your colleague's workplace, because the worst thing you want to do is have that be institutionalized and have that as an accepted part of the culture, because the employees will see an even greater impact if it's allowed by the leadership. Then you're setting a tone and you're sending a message.
And the message that they're sending is what?
And that it's okay. It's acceptable. That people are not as important as product, and that they don't care as much about how people are treated. They don't care as much about people being able to function in the workplace with dignity and respect. Right. And that's not the message that you want to send to your staff.
So what is the impact of bullying? So people feel mistreated, abused, disrespected.
Absolutely.
Does that impact the teaming, or the productivity? What does the stats say? What does the data say?
And actually, what you mentioned, PTSD, has been reported in many of the cases. Many of the cases that have been reported, they see psychologists as a result, or psychiatrists as a result. It impacts their personal lives. As we know, we work for 8 to 10 hours a day, many of us, and take work home with us, and it impacts personal relationships.
In what way, Salandra? How does it impact personal relationships?
How does that show up? Outside of work.
It shows up. There were a couple of reports that I read, surveys that reported a great impact on marriage and family life. People who are unable to function, they get depressed. They're not able to function at home. And of course, they're not functioning as they should at work. Sometimes at work, we can put on a mask and we can sort of plug through. And then when we get home, they take the brunt of it. The people in our homes see the effects, and they're living with the effects, because that's our shoes off self. That's when we let our guards down, and then we're hostile or a little more tightly wound at home than we normally would be.
Well, I'm curious, because what that strikes me, I know, some time ago we did a piece on domestic violence, and where, the roles can kind of flip, where the abuser becomes, the abuser. Exactly, and that's what I'm hearing you say. So the bullied now can become the bullier, because they're flipping the script when they get home.
Absolutely.
That's the person they can act out on. Is that what you hear?
They have less risk to vent their frustration and anger.
Absolutely. There's a different interest in your personal relationships, and a different dynamic, really, in your personal relationships than at the job. You don't have the same kind of consequences and conversations that you need to have in the workplace.
Yeah. The thing that struck me, too, going back to your point about what happens in the workplace, and especially if it's owned and not dealt with by the upper management, does it then shift the culture where potentially people can feel like, well, this is how I need to act as a coworker? That I now take on this persona?
Like a cancer almost.
Exactly.
Yeah. Absolutely. It really does erode the health of the organization, and it breaks down your teams. It hinders communication. It hinders idea sharing. If you can't develop, as we know, great relationships anywhere, then it's going to compromise our product. It's going to compromise our work product, our productivity. It also affects absenteeism. And so managers can monitor that. And if employees are starting to get sick or call off a lot, or they notice a pattern around certain workplace meetings or things, then then that's an indication that something might be going on.
Right. Well, Salandra, it's interesting that you raise that again, because, again, looking at the stats, because sometimes Norman and I really bring the stats in because people feel like, well, this is kind of a one-off situation. But this is pretty pervasive. At least 50% of Americans say that they have been bullied, if not 50 to 80%. And it costs American industry, what, $3 billion a year?
Yes.
Or is that $38 billion?
$3 billion.
$3 billion. And that's a lot of money.
Absolutely.
And in terms of lost productivity.
Absolutely.
And then $19 billion in terms of lost employment. That's when people just quit and say, I've had enough, or they shut down on the job or whatever. So it's a real cost to organizations when they don't really address this. So it's one thing for them to say this is one individual situation that's going on here, but the data suggests that there's a real price to our society and to our productivity in an organization.
Yes, it's time and money, and unfortunately, if employers are not keeping their ears to the ground and have a pulse on their culture and shifts in staff behavior, then they might be oblivious to what's happening in the workplace. So you really do have to focus on, for the leadership, creating a culture of open communication, having a lot of feedback shared, two-way feedback, really upward and downward.
Well, picking up your point again, if the organization is aware of it, it's being brought to their attention. I understand I may have whatever my recourse is against the individual, but can I, in fact, also broaden that to hold the organization on a larger scale responsible, or am I just kind of left with the person that's doing the bullying? How's that work?
That's a really good question.
Are you talking about like this whole notion of a hostile work environment?
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, that's a great question. So bullying is distinguished from a hostile work environment in that, particularly with the EEOC's definition, hostile work environment is typically for protected classes. And so discrimination or harassment in the workplace, rather, is a form of discrimination, and there are Title VII EEOC categories that are protected. So if you're a protected class, we're talking about race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and age. Those, and if you're in D.C., there are several more that are added. D.C. and California have more generous laws for employees. So with a hostile work environment, if you're not a member of a protected class, it's not necessarily illegal. There have been very few cases that have been litigated under bullying where either punitive damages have been awarded or the employer is held liable. If it is pervasive and if you can prove the actions and prove that the employer knew about it and didn't take steps to resolve it, then you may have a lawsuit. I would advise people to speak to an attorney on that. But there are fewer cases if you're not a member of a protected class, because that's not under the protection of the law.
Let me ask you this, Salandra. When you say if you're not a member of a protected class, if your boss that's bullying you, it's the same race, gender, ethnicity, or protected class as you are, is that considered discriminatory or a basis for litigation?
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. It could be. If it's less likely if they're the same member. What you would have to do is establish a pattern and establish that the behavior is intended to intimidate or impact the individual's performance or credentials, status in the workplace. And particularly if it's your boss, they're already in a position of power, so they have impact over your employment status and your standing.
Okay. And the organization, well, I guess we're going to go to a commercial break pretty soon here. But when we come back from our commercial break, Salandra, I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about, help us get in the head of the bullier, the person that's doing the bullying. What's going on with them and what are those triggers? So we're going to come back from commercial break again, excuse me, with this cold that I'm struggling with. But this is Dr. V, your host of Workin It Out. We're on HUR Voices, Sirius XM Channel 141, and we'll be back with my cold and all.
All right.
Share your questions for Dr. V and Norman B. by emailing us at drv@workinitoutradio.com or normanb@workinitoutradio.com.
Welcome back to Workin It Out. Our topic today, we're adding a new feature, which really is what are my rights? And once a month, we're going to feature our renowned HR guru and expert, Salandra Fleming.
She is it.
And she is it. She's awesome. And we were just talking about, you would think she's on radio every day. She's so good. And what we're talking about today is the whole notion of bullying, and with a specific focus on your boss being a bully. And when we were talking earlier, we talked about the impact of bullying in the work environment in terms of it's costing American industry $3 billion a year, $19 billion in lost employment, and then just the personal impact on individuals. Almost half of Americans reported being bullied at some point in their work. So it's a tremendous cost.
And the impact in the home.
And the impact in the home when they go home, and either they're bullying people in their home.
Exactly.
Or in fact just shutting down and being depressed and just not communicative. So it really has a ripple effect.
It does.
And so what we said to Salandra is when we come back on our commercial break, we want to get into the head of the bully. The boss that's a bully.
Yeah, what's going on there?
What's going on, Salandra? What makes a person, and I don't know if that's a fair question to ask you, because it's probably multiple factors that contribute to that, but what makes a boss a bully?
Well, thank you for the very generous introduction. Let's talk a little bit about that, because, you think about the bullies that we might have experienced in grade school. I know we had one, and I think every school probably has at least one.
I think the nation may be experiencing one right now, but we won't talk about that today.
Yes, very unfortunate how that has escalated. And a bully really functions out of insecurity and fear. It is really a source of trying to gain control, which is what some of us do when we are afraid. Then our extreme reaction is to lash out and do something extreme and harsh to someone else to try and gain control. So it's a fear and insecurity, a sense of competitiveness, a sense of not having a firm grounding in your own space. And so you have to do something that's harmful to someone else in order to make you feel better, which of course is temporary. And then it, of course, harms the victim and everyone else who's watching. And so these behaviors can play out in different ways. We have those that could be two-faced. They're talking one way in front of the victim, and then they're making disparaging remarks in front of other people.
About the victim?
Absolutely. To try to discredit them or derail them at the workplace, either on a project or just their general professionalism.
Well, that's interesting. So you're saying this bullying can be kind of outside of the realm of just dealing with the individual who may be trying to bully. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's why it affects so many people. We have such higher statistics for people who have been impacted, because it not only involves the victim, but sometimes it involves the people that they're coercing and trying to rally to get them in their corner to help them do what they're trying to do.
Yeah, it's almost like also the people who are observing the bullying. They're impacted by that because it creates a fear in them.
Absolutely.
To really deal with the
stuff coming your way.
It's so interesting, and as part of our clinical training, we often talked about the walking wounded. That's not a professional diagnostic category, but we have people who come into the workplace who have so many needs that they're trying to resolve or address, and come in wounded in ways that are independent from the workspace, but they bring those wounds and those issues in with them to the workplace and act them out on other people. So when you have a boss that's a bully, from an HR perspective, what is an individual's rights to deal with that? What would you? I mean, what rights do they have to raise that as an issue? To go to HR and expect that something happens? To go to the individual supervisor and expect that they do something? What are their rights?
Good question. So I encourage everyone to buddy up with their HR person and just have a good general relationship with HR, and just learn how they operate and their motivations. And when something like this happens, to loop them in very quickly. Don't wait until it gets bad enough. Help them, loop them in so that they can help monitor the behavior with you. So I would go to HR for advice if it's your boss, especially because you don't have that next level supervisor. Get some advice from HR. And then I also encourage people to get an ally within the organization, someone in a position of power. And if you can find that person who knows how the company operates and knows the values, then that's going to be another person in your corner who can help either observe or help you deal with that, either on your own or whether you're going to address the employee directly. And then there's also policies in the workplace. Most people have a handbook Everyone should have a handbook. There's a code of conduct in most of them. There are policies on harassment, and I would consider that the closest to what we're talking about with bullying, even if it's not a protected class. There's usually something in the code of conduct that indicates that respectful behavior must be the case in a workplace, so that people can come and feel free to contribute the way they need to. So I would definitely advise people to go and consult their handbook and take it to HR and walk through it together and get some recommendations on how to address the behavior, but I would not stay silent.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this, because I know this oftentimes, especially when I'm out in the workplace, Coach, and you make that point to folks that, HR is there to help you. Right. The first thing we generally hear is, but I'm afraid, because if I go talk to, then they're going to talk to the boss, and now it's just going to get worse.
Right.
So what kind of protections or guarantees, whatever term you want to fit there, do you share with the employee who may have that concern, who says, I don't know if I can trust those folks if I go in there?
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's real talk.
Yeah,
everybody doesn't trust their HR person.
In fact, a lot of organizations where people don't trust HR.
Absolutely.
Because they feel HR is on the side of the organization, not them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I always ask people to test that, to make sure, find out if that's really the case, or is that just what you believe and what others believe, because you could be forfeiting your rights.
Okay.
And I even say it to my employees, if you've heard something, challenge me, test me, and find out for yourself, because that perception is a barrier. Perception is not reality. That can sometimes be a barrier. Now, if you have proof and you know for a fact that HR is, quote unquote, on management side, then that's all the more reason to go to a mentor and talk to a mentor, another trusted source, someone in a position of power in the organization that can help you navigate through that. And if you don't have anyone internally, or maybe your mentor is not in the organization, it may be that you talk to an attorney and find out what your rights are. It's not that you don't have any case for any, it depends on the severity and the length of time and all the factors that the attorney will take from you. And also, many places have an employee assistance program. Now, I know most EAPs will not advise them on action against their employer.
Right.
So that's going to be a barrier with the EAP on this particular issue. But they may be able to provide some counseling, and that counselor might give you some advice on how to navigate through that.
So you mentioned a couple of times in terms of finding an advocate that has power. So what are you saying when you say find an advocate that has power? Are you suggesting to an individual that it's not always the best strategy for them to deal directly with the bully themselves, that it's better sometimes to get somebody from the outside to deal with them?
I'd say it depends on the personalities. It's hard to predict how one will react. And I don't know, in each organization, there's a difference between how tightly woven the management staff is and how close they are to the staff, what the culture of communication is in an organization. So I definitely tell them to talk. I would definitely tell them, if they can, talk to HR, but also someone who's in a management position, because that will be an additional voice for them if they feel like HR is not going to be helpful to them.
Well, what is the role of HR? We talk about talk to HR, but what is HR supposed to do in the best situations? What is their role in an organization versus maybe what the practice is? Right.
Well, HR is definitely there for the protection of the organization, and this is one of the roles that HR plays. In some organizations, it can be that they're there for the protection of employees. In non-unionized environments, employees don't have formal representation, and HR can be set up, as it is in my organization, to be someone who's impartial and in the middle and has no vested interest on either side. Okay. That is probably not the norm, though. So HR is there to protect the interests of the organization, but if you have a good HR person, they're going to know that bullying in the tolerating bullying in the workplace is not in the best interest of the organization, because the workers can't do their work.
So is HR protected if they decide to support?
Oh, absolutely.
A person says, look, I'm being bullied, and HR says, okay, we're going to do an investigation. Are they then protected in terms of being independent from either the supervisor who's a bully or the person that is raising a claim?
Absolutely. Those investigations should always be impartial.
Okay. Okay. Whether the HR organizations that are protect the organization or not, it should be impartial.
They should always be impartial.
Well, it struck me that in listening to you that the word of courage really comes to mind, because to not continue in an abusive situation, to be bullied, whether it's in the workplace or in one's personal life or whatever, it takes a certain amount of courage. And we know that they can be beaten out of people, with repetitive bullying. But how do you suggest that people find their courage spot, a spot to be courageous? Or a time to be courageous.
Yeah. Sometimes we have to get fed up with ourselves. We have to get to the end of our own ropes. And some people have a higher tolerance for this kind of behavior than others. It really depends on how much it's impacting you. Right. And some people are conflict avoidant. So if you happen to be one of those personality styles and you don't tend to like or don't tend to enjoy addressing conflict properly, then I would partner with someone who is good at that.
Okay.
I would get someone who can handle that well, and someone who is a strong and firm person in how they deal with conflict, and get that person to help push you along on that continuum.
Well, we have a couple of minutes before we close out this segment, but the good thing is that we can continue talking the bullying piece and maybe continue even aspects of this. My boss is a bully. But is there one particular behavior or behavior response to bullying that you suggest that people don't do? So you're being bullied.
Yes.
So what shouldn't I do?
Don't bully back.
Don't bully back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a bad idea. And then that throws you, it's sort of like who throws the first punch. Well, if both people wind up throwing punches, you both get fired.
Okay. I was wondering about that because we're going to have a segment on workplace violence. And again, some of the data suggests that when people get pushed to the brink, that sometimes it results in workplace violence. But we don't have time to talk about that today, but we're going to have you back to talk about workplace violence as not an antidote for stress, means stress in the workplace.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, your host of Workin It Out, and our topic today is My Boss is a Bully, and this is our new feature we're adding, the HR segment. And I'm asking Norm to, as you usually do, to give us what is one of your major one or two takeaways from our conversation today with Salandra.
Well, there's two that really struck me that you shared with Salandra, and that was one, finding that advocate or ally in the workplace to kind of help you and support you as you go along. And then don't be afraid, to use the HR system to help you out. I think, again, we can get that message across, and I think that's been strong from you today, and that's a big takeaway I think our listeners can really use and work with.
Well, thank you, Norm, as you usually do such a nice wrap and summary for us. And I would just like to add one point that we haven't talked about.
Yes.
I think it's important for people to make sure, and for an individual to check themselves out, to make sure that, in fact, they're not part of the issue. Sometimes we can say it's bullying, and in fact, our behavior might be generating another kind of response, and we're going to explore that as well in an upcoming series.
Great.
So I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, Dr. V, your host of Workin It Out. We're on HUR Sirius XM Channel 141, and today we have been talking about bullying in the workplace, but specifically, I have a cold. My boss is a bully, and we just really thank you for tuning in.
Yes, indeed.
To our show, and we will continue this bullying series in our upcoming sessions, looking at peers as bullies, as well as how does discrimination and harassment play into this whole bullying dynamic. Have a great and productive week, and triumph over your workplace stress.
Email your work-related questions to www.workinitout.com.